Welcome to the Handful of Leaves podcast. My name is Cheryl, and today we have Heng Yeh, who is a writer, translator, and poet from Malaysia. His poetry has appeared in various publications and was twice nominated for the Pushcart Prize. He also contributes to Penang Monthly, writes for the theatre, and runs workshops. Last year, he did a residency in Rimbun Dahan and was a writing fellow at a public space. He's currently the poetry editor of NutMag. Penang. Heng Yeh is one of my closest friends, and I'm so excited to have him here to discuss with me the topic of grief. Welcome, Heng Yeh. How are you feeling?
Hello, a bit nervous, but feeling good and excited about the discussion that we'll be having.
We will have the opportunity to listen to his poem at the end of this episode, so stay tuned to hear his masterpiece. Grief is a very delicate topic, and as Heng Yeh and I was discussing how to go about this, we feel that we should start with a poem and then slowly discuss all the nuances and aspects of grief. Hopefully, we can learn from this human experience.
We have poems because it helps us connect to other people's experiences of this very universal feeling.
The poem is When I Am Asked by Lisel Mueller. When I am asked how I began writing poems, I talk about the indifference of nature. It was soon after my mother died, a brilliant June day, everything blooming. I sat on a grey stone bench in a lovingly planted garden. But the daylilies were as deaf as the ears of drunken sleepers, and the roses curved inward. Nothing was black or broken, and not a leaf fell, and the sun blared endless commercials for summer holiday. I sat on a grey stone bench, ringed with the ingenuine faces of pink and white impatience, and placed my grief in the mouth of language, the only thing that would grieve with me.
I think when I first read it, I had already started writing poems then. It definitely resonated in the sense that sometimes when there's no one or nothing you feel like you can turn to, poetry is like the outlet or the place where you can capture or allow an emotion to exist. In the poem, she talks about language being the only thing that grieves with her, but language actually also means humanity because humans are the ones who come up with language. Even though on the surface the poem looks like she is feeling very isolated, I think she actually also finds comfort in the fact that it is a shared experience, right? And people have talked about it before. And that's why language is one of the bridges, or art in general, that helps us connect to this realization that we are not alone when it comes to this. So when I was reading, I was like, oh, that's so true. Sometimes some of the poems I write also has this similar purpose, I guess you could call it. How did you feel reading about it, especially if you don't usually read a lot of poetry? What do you feel about it?
I think what I felt from this was the author's sense of loneliness as she experienced the death of her mother, yet at the same time, the world moved on. And I think that's very much an accurate description of grief, where your heart could be broken into a million pieces, but then, the day still turns into nights and life continue to move on.
There are many types of grief, right? The death of a loved one, a relationship ends or a friendship ends. That's a kind of grieving. Sometimes you grieve for maybe chances you didn't take. So there's always a kind of sense that you've lost something forever, right? It's a kind of a feeling of permanence in the loss, right? That is what makes it so heavy. And I really love what you pointed out about the persona in the poem, that this kind of paradox in your heart, the world should stop, but somehow it still moves on. There's a very famous poem by Auden that has the line, "Stop all the clocks," because his loved one has died. It's that recurring feeling that people have in grief, yeah.
Grief is the natural response to bereavement. And when you talk about the different types of grief, I think why it hits so deeply is because a person or people close to us that we grieve for usually has an impact on our sense of identity. And they give us something. So, for example, a safe haven in relationships, the idea of a self esteem coming from parents When from young they constantly validate you, then you have this sense of self, like either I'm a good person, bad person, I'm funny, whatever. So
Right.
when we lose this person, then our identity just becomes like so uncertain. It becomes like a huge shock of like, what am I? Who am I?
But I really like what you said about the identity, because that person was such a big part of our lives and how we perceive ourselves, that losing them was also losing a part of ourselves. In life, we have so many different relationships, but we always show a slightly different version of ourselves to that specific person. So only that person knows us in that way. And it could be a parent, a friend, or a lover, or even an acquaintance. Sometimes when you lose that person, you don't even realize what you're losing yet, but it's only after time that you kind of realize that, oh, I have not been able to show this side of myself, or this side of myself only comes out when I was with them. Now that is not happening anymore, then you feel that absence almost. Yeah.
When losing a best friend due
Mm,
to the normal circumstances of life, either I change, the person changed, or we change, right?
mm,
And sometimes I would reminisce or I would just be nostalgic about the idea that, oh, I don't really get to be so open about certain things that I only shared exclusively with this person. And I don't have that opportunity anymore. So that what that person provided to me is just taken away. And so the interesting thing is that, yes, that happens, but then that changes too. I start to form friendships, relationships with other people, and I am then able to bond in a similar way of intimacy as I have used to with the person again. And
mm,
there's a kind of renewed optimism towards life. If we look into the process of grieving, is
mm,
first, of course, the acceptance of the loss, like in my example, like the loss of a friendship. But the second thing is
mm,
about accepting the consequence of the loss. So, what
mm,
losing intimacy or that space to just self and share exclusive things means to you? You need to
mm,
accept that consequence. After that, we have to change the relationship to the person we lost. The death of a stage of life means a birth of a new stage of life. And
mm,
as we go through this process of grief, a very important milestone to hit in the process of grieving is the restoration of the capacity to strive again in life. So that's where I feel I process the friendship, where it's fine if I don't share this part of myself. I could express myself in other ways and start to explore the world, start to explore new friendships. And then that helps me to look into the future with more optimism and happiness, which is kind of the baseline state
mm.
for the grief happen.
I want to pick up on things that you mentioned there, which is the point that your relationship to the person you're grieving changes throughout the grieving
Mm,
and after the grieving. A lot of the times when we build relationships, we are building them in the future, right? We are thinking this relationship in terms of being something that will accompany us throughout the foreseeable future or even a lifetime. When that is lost, you lose an entire future with them that you have been
mm,
building up with your head, right? And so
mm,
you have to stop becoming attached to that future and come back to the present. That future is non-existent anymore. So it's a reckoning of the fact that this life that you created in your head will not be able to happen.
to the Buddhas, they said all conditioned things are uncertain. It is only merely an illusion. What would be a better way to look at the world is to try
Mhm.
your best to understand impermanence in every conditioned thing.
I think this is a kind of question that I've always been grappling with. How do you hold that knowledge or try to hold that understanding? Everything is uncertain, everything is impermanent. Then still go about your day and then like, oh, you have to send an email, there's a deadline, right? How to not let it negatively affect your relationships with people. Some people don't allow themselves to love or be loved, right? On like a deep level.
Do you feel that's you?
No, I hope that's not me, or I try not to be that.
How do you try not to be, right? Like, I'm just putting back your question to
Hmm.
you.
Yes. So I saw a quote on social media that
Basic.
I feel like it's been bouncing around for quite some time because I was trying to find the original source, but I couldn't. But it's basically don't borrow grief from the future. And I was like, wow, so powerful. The idea is that yes, you can acknowledge that it will be all these relationships and people and the material world is and filled with uncertainty. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that just because of that, I should cut off everyone and I shouldn't let myself feel things. But is just to enjoy the present moments, like not being attached to the future, because even if you're attached to a future of loss, that is still a future that you're attaching to. So to just come back to the present and really enjoy what is there and appreciate it, and knowing that it is impermanent, in fact, can help you deepen your appreciation as opposed to scaring you away from it. And to just embrace that it's just part of life, to have to go through these feelings.
I completely agree with you. This grief is part of life. It is the result of everything being conditioned to destruction, everything being conditioned to change, and everything being conditioned to breaking apart. True equanimity, where you see things with right view and then you accept them, rather than seeing things with wrong view and try to run away from everything. And then I don't know where you go and hide from life suffering, because there's no way you can hide from it, right?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
true.
It's very interesting how the Buddha balanced this as well, where we still have
Mm,
to live in the world, yet at the same time, we need to align ourselves to right views. In the Buddha's time, there was this king, Pasenadi, who loved
mm,
his queen Malika very, very much. So one day he was just chilling with the Buddha. Then his assistant came and said, "Oh, your queen Malika has died." And then he was very, very heartbroken because he loved her very much. And so lucky him, the Buddha was there. So the Buddha was there to advise him. Like, I would summarize this. The first part is the Buddha reminded him this. He says that what is subject to aging will have to age.
mm,
What is
mm,
subject to illness will become ill. And what is subject to death will die. What is subject to ending will end. And what is subject to destruction will be destroyed. And in each of these statements, the Buddha emphasized that no one, not even contemplatives, Brahmans, the Devas, Maras, and Brahmas, which are like quite big gods, or anyone else in the world can prevent these processes from occurring. And
mm,
this really underscores the Buddha's concept of impermanence and the futility of clinging to these things. And then the Buddha talked about two kinds of people. So the kind of people who are like run of the mill, uninch basic bitches, like me.
like us, yeah.
He said, okay, so these people then, when they experience this kind of change, when their loved ones die, they respond with negative emotions, sorrow,
Mm,
grief, lamentation, and distress, and leads to harmful consequences. And this pleases their enemies and worries their friends. When he used this term uninstructed run of the mill, it's very interesting because it also implies that yes, most people react this way, but there is an alternative, which is that the noble ones who practice, because of their practice and understanding of the right view, they are able to experience all of these things, and instead they pull out this poison arrow of sorrow that pierces them. Okay, but this is not the ending. The most mind-blowing part is, sure, the Buddha reminds you of all this truth of life, but then he goes on to say, where and however an aim is accomplished through eulogies, chants, good sayings, donations, and family customs, follow them diligently there and that way. Isn't that amazing?
I love that he ended with that because he realized that most of us are basic bitches. We need this kind of processes when it overtakes you, right? When it
Mm.
consumes you. For example, you can't even do basic tasks and it becomes detrimental. It can reach that point. It can actually reach that point, which is why it's so terrifying. Last year, one of my aunts passed away. I think that was the last funeral that I had attended. I was really struck by the use of the rites, the whole organizational process, and how family members are expected to come and do things like a lot of chanting and burning things. And you send the coffin to the cemetery and then watch it get lowered into the ground. And as a kid, you don't really understand this, why we have these rituals. And it's almost scary and it's uncomfortable. People are crying here and there. You are not sure what's going on. At this age now, I realize how important it is because it, number one, it gives you a sense of closure, and it also brings the community together as a family.
Mm.
So even as you're burning the paper money, then you're talking about memories or even just catching up because you haven't seen each other for years. Kind of nice that in the grieving process, people can come together and
Mm.
do things together to remember a person.
And those
Yeah.
rituals are simply a means to healing together as
Yes.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
community.
So I agree with what the Buddha said. What is the aim? And I feel it's actually to help us heal and not to heal and then move on, but to heal by remembering the person, right? And remember the entirety of their life and not just their death, right?
On average, research shows that when one person dies, there are 9 people that is bereaved. Those 9 people are like friends, family, and close friends. It also means that those 9 people can come together and help each other to heal. That's what has been helpful for you in your past.
It might be hard to talk about actionable steps if you're the one who is grieving, because the whole nature of something like grief is that it's so overwhelming that you can barely think logically. And then all the usual things, taking a shower or cooking a meal for yourself, seems absurd because you're not even in a state of mind to think about those kind of things. But I think that one thing that is just to know that it will pass in time. And maybe that will sound very horrible, like, oh, so as time goes on, I won't feel so sad about this person anymore. But I think of a glass jar with a black ball in the middle. The glass jar is your life or yourself. The black ball is grief. The black ball getting smaller over time. Or many people think that grief is like actually the glass jar expands. So the size of your grief will stay the same. The absence that a person leaves behind will not change, because as life goes on, as it has to, your life will expand and you also continue to grow as a person. But the grief you carry can still be there and there can still be space for it. Just that it would feel less overwhelming because you have more time, more space to process, to grow, to come to terms with the fact that this person is not present in the way that they once was.
And how
I don't
did
know.
that look like in your life?
It goes underground for a very long time. And sometimes for long stretches of that time, you don't even think about the person. And then suddenly something comes up, right? Maybe you read an old email or you hear a song, something triggers it. And then suddenly you're like, oh shit, that person is really gone. Like suddenly you're living with that emotion again. And a lot of the times it feels just as intense. You're just as sad as when you first lost them. But just that now you have a different perspective. You're now a slightly different person. But you can still go about your day. It is something I find that you continuously live with. It's very almost cyclical.
Actually, on the neuro, like biological side,
Mhm.
Dr. Andrew Huberman, he's quite a famous YouTuber. He shared that grief is held up by 3 things: time, space, and closeness. So time is more about the idea of when will I see the person next, and space, where is the person? And when a person dies, time obviously it's taken away. You will never see the person again. Space depends on what you believe, right? If you believe in heaven, sure they're there. If you don't believe there's anything, then sure there's this void in the space. And our brain in grief goes into a motivation state. So motivation state is described as when you're very, very, very hungry, you're just separated from that wall of delicious food. So that state where you're like very highly agitated, highly motivated because you're so deprived and you're just so close to the food. Grief is the motivated state to close the gap that you can never close. Or recovering from grief is described as that motivated state waning away in time. And I thought,
Mm.
wow, it's beautiful.
I really love when you say there's delicious food in front of you, but there's a wall separating you. And I'm like, that is what grief feels like, because in our minds, the person is alive, but the world sees them as they are not present anymore. There is such a strong contrast between what we want to be real versus what is real. And I feel like that's such a um like, yeah, we really do need to have compassion for everyone and even ourselves, because everyone will have to go through it one day or another.
That is truly humbling to just be reminded again about the universality of the conditions that all of us face. I do want to extend this further to the practice of metta, the unconditional loving kindness. So one of my teachers, Ajahn Achalo, actually advised a person who was in heartbreak, and he shared that whenever you're feeling that pain, send yourself metta, have compassion to yourself, and at the same time also send yourself this feeling of goodwill and well-wishing to all the people who are experiencing grief in this moment with you. Turn oh, it's all about me into an act of empowerment. You're healing yourself and also you're using that uplifted energy to help others.
Because grief can be quite selfish, right? You're holding on to your vision of that person or that relationship with that person that you've built up in your mind. So I'm not saying selfish in as a kind of judgment value, but it is centered around how you see the world with that relationship in it. Because the grieving process is so inherently centered around the self, we need to have an understanding of changing how we are relating to that person. We also have to understand how we are viewing ourselves. For example, how long is too long to hold on to sorrow? How long is too long to punish ourselves? Channel that sorrow into compassion to rejoin the world again and connect with other people, connect with yourself instead.
We suffer to the degree that we attach to its permanent. So, yes, it's very tied up and bound up to this idea of self. And while we live in the world with a self, I think the most important thing is to not annihilate that in the sense of like, I'm not going to have a sense of self tomorrow or build up the ego of no ego, but rather, how do we live as a skillful self? How do we live as a good self? Starting with generosity. Because what that essentially does is that it teaches you how to let go. And if we tie that
Right.
back to grief, it's all about letting go and letting go of our expectations, letting go of constancy, and accepting the change that has been brought upon us. It's definitely difficult because I sway between sometimes life is really just like that, that you better just accept it as it is and stop fighting because the more you fight, the more you suffer. But then there are
Mm.
days where it's like, no, how could this be happening?
Then
Right?
the
So
glass wall is there again, yeah.
yeah, right. The glass ball becomes everything I see. I think life is really just the process of getting up again and again, even though the glass ball
Mm.
is gonna hit you left, right, and center.
Another thing about generosity, which I think is such an important point, the loss that we feel so personal, precisely because of that personal relationship we have with that person. But sometimes when we talk to other people who are also grieving for that person, though maybe in a different way than you, you'll be surprised to hear that, oh, it turns out that this person has this side to them, or that they play all these different roles, or that these people perceive them in these certain ways that like you've never thought about.
Mm.
And sometimes it's nice to let go of your own individual perception of that person to accommodate this expanding understanding of who this person actually was in their life, that they weren't
Mm.
just a friend to you, or they weren't just a father to you, or they weren't just
Mm.
your boss, but they were all these multiple other roles as well. um and
Yes.
yeah.
Part of the process of grief is you will go through the obsession of the person. You think of
Mm,
the person nonstop. And most of the time, it would be relating to how that person was to you. When you expand it to just knowing them as a person, the different roles that they play in life, you can cultivate one of the Brahma Viharas, which the Buddha calls mudita, an appreciative joy of the person in the sense it doesn't have that clinging of like me
mm,
involved in everything about the person, but rather, oh, the person's goodness as a person and rejoicing
mm,
in that with as much love as you would as when you appreciate a beautiful flower without wanting to pluck it. So
mm.
yeah, it's very beautiful that you shared that. Thanks. Okay, I think we did cover a lot about grief, and
Mm.
Heng Yeh and I thought it would be nice to end with a poem that would let you concretize your feelings and experience of grief. So Heng Yeh, over to you.
So the poem that I've chosen to share was one that I wrote this year. And the title is Love is Watching Someone Die. So for those of you who are familiar with this line, it's actually taken from a song by a band called Death Cab for Cutie, and the song is What Sarah Said. I feel like it's such a good and the nature of loving and grieving. And I was also thinking of the movie Arrival when I wrote this, because no spoilers, but it's also very much about how do you love while accepting that grief is part of the bargain. So I wrote this poem, which I shall read now. Love is watching someone die. In this particular instance, I am thinking about my mother, but really it will be everyone you know. There's no one to blame. It's human nature to die. All of time is a circle, the way all language is a circling around what we cannot answer. The question being, if what is worth loving must also be worth losing, what do you choose? There is no answer. You choose with your life.
Thank you so much, Heng Yeh, for sharing a piece of yourself and for coming on to this episode with us. To end this episode, we invite the listeners to choose with your life. Feel free to share with us what you thought about the poem, what you thought about this episode in our Telegram.
As long as there's love, there will be grief. The grief of time passing, of life moving on, half finished, of empty spaces. They were once bursting with laughter and energy of the people we love. As long as there's love, there will be grief. Because grief is love's natural continuation. Grief is a giant neon sign, protruding through everything, pointing everywhere, broadcasting loudly. Love was here. In the finer print, quietly, love
Still
is.